Let's date forever. Here's your weekly dose of relationship fuel with Sammy and Nathan Yeager. Hello and welcome to Date Forever. In this week's episode, we're chatting about the value of relationship therapy, unpacking your attachment style, sharing emotional snippets with your partner, and learning the skill of vulnerability. But before we dive into that, Sammy, what's been fueling you up this week?
Well, after spending some time in Adelaide last week, you whisked me off from the airport for date night. And it literally was from the airport straight to date night because my flight was cancelled and then rebooked. So we had a really fun date night at Sydney Fringe. We went to a burlesque showcase night and it was super fun. Drag is one of my most favourite things. So there was a bit of that. Some nudity, some sex, some comedy. It was great.
Yeah. It was a bit silly and fun and
but it was really nice to spend some time with you after being apart for almost a week. Yeah, and also honouring my commitment to be there for date night and making sure that even when my flight was cancelled that I hustled to be there.
Yeah, we just had to rearrange plans a little bit. We were going to do dinner beforehand, just had to shuffle dinner to afterwards. But yeah, it was good fun.
Yeah, so that really fueled me up. But also on top of that was that I then was home for one night and then went off for girls' weekend with some friends. So that was really nice. It was pretty low key. We just had a big house and cooked and hung out and spent uninterrupted time together, which was beautiful. So my relationship tanks are feeling very full, which is beautiful. But yeah, those are my fuel ups. What about you, Nath?
So mine's a little bit more adulty. Like definitely date night was one of my fuel ups. But mine's a little bit more adulty in that we have signed up recently to a course about finances. So
we can give it a plug.
Yeah, we can.
Lovely Melissa Brown, who wrote a book called Unfuck Your Finances. She's actually a peer of mine. We are members of the same female entrepreneur community. She's ex-accountant, ex-financial planner, and she's put together this course. And we are, 2 weeks in?
Yeah, 1 week in now. Well, I think this is week 2 now, yeah. So yeah, it's been really nice to dive in and learn a bit more about our money styles and habits and things like that. So it's an 8-week program running over the next 10 weeks or so. So yeah, really keen to dive in and learn a little bit more about our money psychology, but then also some more practical tips and plans, I guess, on how we can better manage our finances. So super keen for that.
Well, and not just manage our finances, but to really take care of our wealth and lifestyle tank.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. Look at some of our spending habits or not spending habits, and how we can really get the most out of our life from a wealth and a lifestyle perspective.
Yeah, and what are we designing for?
Yeah, absolutely. But now, here's this week's guest.
Today we've got Jason Polk joining us. Jason has been a relationship therapist for almost a decade after his divorce inspired him to become one. He's now happily married and has 2 young kids and loves helping couples to have loving and cherishing relationships. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, I'm curious how many relationship therapists, coaches, counselors end up there because they had their own turbulent experience with their romantic relationship. I reckon it would be a few.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, why else would you become a relationship counselor? Yeah, that's definitely been my journey. I was a therapist at the time of my divorce, and it was one of those, okay, what do I do next? My ex-wife and I, we went to a lot of couples therapy, some good, some bad. And then I kind of decided, wow, I want to be a couples therapist, especially experiencing the difference between, I think, different skill levels of therapists. And so that's why I do what I do.
So take us back. So you've had a relationship that was under the institution of marriage, and now you work with couples who are moving through those kind of things. So can you tell us a little bit about like what you learned in your first marriage that you have taken and applied to your current marriage?
Yeah, I have learned a lot. That's the general response. But I would say, I don't know, in this show, Sammy, Nate, if you two have tackled the topic of attachment theory.
Yeah, we've had
Yeah,
a
we
couple
have
of
a little bit.
episodes talking about, the different types of attachment, but we'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, well, in retrospect, my ex-wife, she is what we call anxious attachment, and I tend to be more of the avoidant attachment. And, kind of like real quick, anxious attachment, I refer to it as they're more concerned about connection or lack thereof. Us avoidantly attached, we're kind of more concerned about, autonomy, space, maybe even personal space. And so basically what happened is my ex-wife would essentially desire more connection. And that could go in different ways. It may initiate connection sort of, I guess, lack of a better word, nicely. But also in retrospect, I think that she would initiate connection. We call it angrily pursuit connection. Lack of a better word, like, oh my God, you have been so disconnected from me. What's your deal, basically? The thing with that, though, is that someone who is avoidantly attached with that sort of energy, and I would say most people with that sort of energy, we will withdraw even more. And so then it continues that cycle of her wanting to pursue and then angrily, and then me wanting to withdraw. And also different sort of like thoughts get formed in your head. Mine was, oh my gosh, what's your deal? Right? She is so crazy. And then she is like, oh my gosh, what's your deal? You are so withdrawn. Right?
Yeah.
And we were just in this pretty nasty cycle. And then, after, it took me a while to like learn it. That was essentially like our core issue. And a lot of what I do in my work now is help people navigate that sort of dance. Because I would say about 70% of the couples that come into my office and clinic have varying degrees of that dance.
Yeah. So what was some of the work that you did yourself, I guess, to even unpack that for yourself, to realize that you were in this avoidant behavior and that you and your wife then were doing this dance?
Yeah, great question. I would say the avoidant behavior being pointed out to me, because here's the thing with avoidant behavior. You don't really think anything's wrong with it. I mean, I guess you could say it the other side as well. But the common stance of avoidant behavior, it's, oh my gosh, I have my stuff together, my partner doesn't, right? Because we tend to be better off with like distance. We tend to be more self-reliant, which are good things. And it's like, oh my gosh, my partner isn't, right? Which actually, in a way, they're just responding to our distance. But answering your question, Nate, a big thing was it being pointed out to me in couples therapy. And then I had to look at it, which is, oh, wow, okay, this is what I do. I withdraw, and then essentially I blame my partner for wanting more connection, thinking they're needy.
And I think sometimes when you are in that circumstance, like that avoidant behavior might be like, oh, well, I'm avoiding the conflict. I'm withdrawing so that we don't have conflict. But then I think that the danger there is that you end up never discussing the things that are the problem in your relationship because you have withdrawn so far. So you're never going to resolve any of the underlying problems that the two of you have.
Yeah, 100%.
If anyone hasn't heard of this concept or this framework before, your attachment style, I think that one of the guests that we've had on the show explained it best as like you have your secure attachment, which is like an anchor, your avoidant attachment as an island, and your anxious attachment as a wave. And they're really about how we like to connect with other humans, other people, and these attachment styles can show up not just in our romantic relationships, but any relationship that we have, and they're your attachment style is generally formed within your first few years of life, with your core relationships being your parents or your guardians. And it's we're on the Date Forever podcast talking about romantic relationships, but also our relationship with self. And I think this is one of the best things that we can go about learning about ourselves. Like, what is our default attachment style? What are some of the patterns of behaviors that show up if we are anxious or avoidant or secure? I think there's like the fourth style of like a disorganized attachment style, where you might be a combination or flitter between the two. But kind of when you were describing, Jason, your relationship with your wife, I was kind of imagining like two magnets, like that were pushing each other away. So like she was trying to get closer to you and you were getting further away, and the energy was just repelling you back of that, anxious style, trying to approach the avoidance style, and really actually probably having the reverse of her intent to bring you the two of you closer together.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and I may use that in my practice.
That's yours. You can have it for free.
Okay, I was saying I could drop your name if you want. No, exactly. That 100%.
So I'm curious, like, why did you start going to therapy? As you said, you were a therapist at the time. Like, what was going on in your marriage that you were like, okay, we've exhausted all of our resources that we have. It's time to get some third-party help.
Yeah, basically, we were miserable. We were fighting so much. And, a quick side note, too. I think finding a therapist is kind of another topic. I'm not saying going into it now, but, I remember I had a therapist friend, and I said, hey, you know what? My ex-wife and I, her name is Liz, we're really struggling. Do you know someone? And he gave us a name. But unfortunately, it seemed like that person didn't have much experience. We got in there, the couples therapist room, and, my ex was pretty animated, passionate. And she started going really with a lot of energy. And I looked at my therapist, and the therapist looked at me, and I was kind of like, okay, what are you going to do anything about it? And the therapist was almost like looking at me like, I don't know what to do. Right? And so it was kind of like a shit show. And it was kind of discouraging too, because it was like, oh yeah, okay, well, couple therapy doesn't work. And so I think that's another important thing that, being a couples therapist, it is not the easiest sort of practice. Like, most people are not going to be able to, sit down and start, working with a couple. And so I would encourage people, especially new to the relationship, that if you want to do couples therapy, it's better to find someone who has a bit of experience, because if not, it could make things worse. And then it can also give you a taste in your mouth of, couples therapy is a waste of time.
Yeah, we had some friends go and see a couples therapist, and they were like, okay, we know that we need some help. And they went and met with somebody, and they both hated the therapist. And then they ended up bonding over the fact that they hated the therapist. They were like, okay, so we agree on that. It's clear that we are able to agree on things.
Yeah.
And that thing is that this therapist was shit. So I thank you for calling that out, because I think that's with any sort of supplier, even if it's like your hairdresser or your dry cleaner or your dentist or your doctor or your physio, your chiro, even where you get coffee, you don't always get that right the first go. I think just with seeing a therapist and going through that process of unpacking some stuff only to figure out that, that wasn't the right person to do that with. And now I have to go through that whole thing again. There is a lot of mental load with that, and it can be quite emotionally exhausting to lay it all out on the table, especially if you've been delaying going to therapy and you've been needing to go for quite some time. There is a lot of backstory that needs to be unpacked. So what are some, other than trying to search down someone who has some experience, is there anything else that you would recommend if couples are thinking, hey, I think we do need to start looking for someone? What should they be looking for?
Yeah, I guess I think it just comes back to, fundamentally experience. There's different acronyms, different modalities in couples therapy. You may have heard EFT, PACT, RLT. There's all these acronyms. And, the way I look at it is the kind of the view to the top is the same, right? And that is, a couple experiencing more harmony, more connection. They have tools. They know how to repair, know how to fight well, and they're both motivated to use those tools, right? We can say that's kind of the top of the mountain, but there's different ways up the mountain. And, I have my own modality, but I'm not like an, evangelicist of that modality, if I said that word right. And so Purist, better. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know how to say that word either.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So, that's my thing. I think it's just experience, and someone who is experienced in their model as a couples therapist, I don't really think it matters too much on what the model is. There's different focus, but fundamentally, the end result from my perspective as a couples therapy is more connection. You have tools and you are motivated to continue to use those tools and continue to grow. Which, side note, which is exactly what you two are doing. I listened to your podcast, right? You two are intentional about the connection, right? You mentioned check-ins, checking in your goals, where you are at weekly. And, that's essentially, doing the work. And so I'm going off on a tangent here. I got this quote, and it was a business quote. Applying this to business is either you're growing or you're dying. I think we apply that to the relationship as well. Either we're connecting or we're disconnecting. And it doesn't have to be huge. It's not like we need to sit down and gaze into each other's eyes for 5 minutes, every hour. Okay, that was a bit much.
Even every day is sometimes a bit much.
Yeah, it's sometimes a bit much, right? But this kind of small things where it's like, okay, the relationship is important to me, and how that is communicated is really, really important. So sorry, I went off on a little tangent there.
No, you can gush over us and our relationship skills any day, which is funny though, because you mentioned that you were a therapist already and that you were having marital issues, and then that really sparked your interest in going and working with more couples. And I think something that sometimes we forget, and I know that even friends probably say things to us occasionally about like how our relationship must be just perfect, and like all of these idealized or romanticized kind of outlooks of our life. And Nathan and I try and be very real like this about what we share on the show, and I've definitely thrown you under the bus a few times, and you've called me out on some of my shit on the show before, but I think like Nate's human, I'm human. I just think we've got a pretty diverse toolkit, and we've got a diverse toolkit because we've now spent 3 and a bit years talking to a couple or an expert every week about what tools they've found. What have they found that works for them? How are they using it? How often are they using it? And why does it work? And not just in your romantic relationship, but in your relationship with yourself. So you kind of use some language there about like what are some of the tools that couples really need, and the key bit being their willingness to use them. But if there were like 3 or 4 that were like fundamentals, like every couple should have these tools in their toolbox, what would they be?
I think a really important one is the ability to be vulnerable and share that. I think vulnerability is really important, especially in terms of repair, also in terms of creating emotional connection, which emotional connection I think is a foundational piece of any intimate relationship. And so vulnerability, essentially, the way I look at it, say something upsets you, right? You're angry at your partner for some reason. Vulnerability is pausing, slowing down, and inquiring about what is underneath that anger, right? For example, if my wife decides to go out with her friends every night of the week, right? Which she doesn't do. Okay, maybe not the best example, but I'll just go with it. And I'm angry at her, which is, you're going out again? Seriously? Come on. Chances are she will respond in a defensive manner to that instead of reaching for the vulnerability, which is, I miss you, or I've been lonely every night this week while you're out partying with your friends. She doesn't party. Don't mean to distract, but trying to be funny. But that's vulnerability, and that's something that she can really hear. And ideally, if she's open to it, that can create connection. I think it can repair, because then we can have a real conversation. If I led with that vulnerability, she'd be like, chances are, oh gosh, I'm sorry. All right, let's talk about this.
Yeah. And in those 2 examples, you can hear very differently, like the different energy that same message is coming from. It's like, it's no longer, I guess, about blaming someone. It's like, it's coming from the place of your own heart, I guess, and being like, well, this is really what's missing for me, or like, this is what I'm really after.
Yeah, 100%, Nathan. And I think that can kind of lead into another skill. I don't know if this makes a top 4, but staying on your side of the street, so to speak, and that's kind of like, the cliche I feel statements, right? Which is, I feel blank. Or here's another good one too. If you're giving feedback to your partner, the story I make up about blank is, right? I'm not saying that I own the objective truth, because that normally doesn't go well. For example, you're selfish, right? Maybe not the best example, but I'm sort of like implying like some objectivity there. And then chances are my partner's going to be pushing against that objectivity. But if I said that, the story I make up here is that you are thinking only of yourself in that incident, right? I'm staying on my side. I'm not trying to imply something. Or here's another one: telling your partner how they think or feel, which sometimes it can be beneficial. But if I say, oh my God, you're mad at me, right? And I just kind of throw it out there and it's not true for my partner, that can sort of be annoying. And so I think it's really important to kind of like stay on your side. And also by that, I mean that you are cognizant of the fact that there are two subjective realities in the relationship. You're not implying that you own the objective truth. And that's really important.
What's that saying? It's like whenever there's two sides to a story, there's actually three. It's like your side, their side, and somewhere in the middle, there's the truth.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily even in the middle.
Yeah, maybe it's not even in the middle. But I really like what you said there about labeling or diagnosing or attaching someone else's feeling, because I find it hard enough to do that for myself sometimes, to figure out like, what is this emotion that I'm feeling, let alone if Nath was like very accusatory telling me how I'm feeling or what feeling I'm feeling. Like, I imagine that's a really complicated thing to even counter once somebody has said, you're mad at me. Like, well, how do I respond to that? Like, what are the options available to me to respond to that? It's like being called, you're so defensive. Yeah, how do I defend being accused of being defensive? Like, I can't, that's a lose. I've painted in a lose-lose corner. But I like the story I'm telling myself is, you didn't think about me today. The story I'm telling myself is, our relationship isn't as important as the ones with your friends or your family. Or the story I'm telling myself is, you don't find me sexy anymore. The story I'm telling myself is, I don't know, whatever other head trash you might have going on. And I'm sure that the stories we make up are more often than not way further from the reality than what we're truly experiencing in that day or in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And, that's why, I encourage couples to, at the very least, share emotional snippets of what's going on with you. It doesn't have to be a lot. But one reason for it is that if left to our own devices, we make up stuff. You said head trash.
Yeah.
What we assume, it's
Clutter.
generally always, it's always negative. But if we can even share like a little bit of emotional snippet, for example, hey, I'm feeling pretty anxious today, if I said that to my wife, or it's been a tough day, and I come home with that anxiety, and maybe I'm kind of withdrawn, I'm not engaged. If I just share a little bit of that, that can go a long way, instead of not saying anything, and my wife is assuming, okay, what's going on with this dude, right? What's going on with him? And it's never assuming the best, right? It's not that she would think, okay, he's just reflecting on how much he loves me, right? So I really encourage couples to, at least share emotional snippets. This is kind of for the avoidant type people, sharing emotions, being aware of emotions, but sharing them may not be the number one thing to do on your list. But I always share just like little snippets can go a really long way.
Yeah. One other thing that Sammy and I say, like, even if we don't really know what we're feeling, we just say, "Oh, I'm just feeling a little bit out of sorts today." Like, and it doesn't need to be, "Oh, I'm feeling A, B, C, or X, Y, Z, or whatever it is," but just saying, "Oh, I'm just not quite feeling myself today," or just feeling a bit out of sorts, and then it might give you the space or allow your partner to go, "All right, well, maybe I shouldn't crack that joke that I would normally crack, or maybe I should crack a joke. I don't know." But like, maybe there's, even giving that little insight to like, oh, maybe my partner's not feeling their best self today. Let's just approach something a little bit differently, maybe.
I definitely think that's something that I struggle with because I have more out of sorts days than Nathan does. Nate's pretty stable. I have high highs and low lows. Nath is like that beautiful, stable spot. The fluctuations aren't very big. So when Nath does have an out of sorts day, moment, period of time, like I often will struggle with like how do I best care for my person in this moment? Like what is it that he needs? Or because I think sometimes we can throw the lens of what would I want in this situation? What would I want if I was out of sorts? And Nathan's not me. So what I might want when I'm out of sorts could be completely different to what he actually wants or needs, even if he isn't able to put language to it. So that's definitely something that I've been working on, particularly in the last couple of years, is a bit more awareness of like, I'm not the benchmark for
the cure or
the cure. Yeah. Like how it's that thing, like, don't treat other people how you would like to be treated. Treat other people how they would like to be treated.
Yeah, 100%. And that's another skill, empathy.
So I want to go back to your first one of vulnerability. I think this is, Brene Brown has done an incredible job of doing a lot of research around vulnerability, shame, and what is it that we're feeling? Why do we avoid it? And bringing some of those conversations to the forefront. But I definitely know that this is not necessarily a skill set that we develop early in life. I don't think we ever went to a vulnerability class as little preschoolers. So if someone is struggling with this, where do we start?
Great question. I think the first place to start is to realize or maybe understand that sharing vulnerability is a good thing. And so I would convince, if someone said, well, why should I be vulnerable? I may say, something like Brene Brown. And Brene Brown had a good quote, and this is kind of a paraphrase, but that is, shame only survives in the dark. And so if we can share that shame with our partner, bring it to light, then kind of like what is shareable is bearable. Also, too, if we share those intimate parts of us that we may not like and our partner responds favorably, it's like, oh my gosh, I can have shame and be connected, right? I can be, imperfect and my partner still wants to be with me. And in fact, if you do share shame with someone who's open to hearing it, it will create more connection. And so I would say to first convince someone that doing such a thing is worthwhile. Now, obviously, you can't be vulnerable like just with whoever, right? Like I used to play American football. Like I'm not going to be vulnerable in the locker room, but I can be vulnerable with my wife, right? Or a therapist.
And that's almost the opposite. I know that can often be like a trauma response when somebody is overly vulnerable or familiar with someone who hasn't yet earned that vulnerability. Like, and maybe everybody's met somebody who's like straight out of the gate oversharing intimate details about their life, their relationship, their experiences. And I think that sometimes that can almost be like, I don't know if weaponized is the right word, but it can be, like a safety response as opposed to an actual bid for connection.
Yeah. I mean, I would say too, someone right at the gate is vulnerable, that, chances are they're we look at boundaries, listening boundaries, speaking boundaries, that there's been some sort of rupture. So that could be a trauma response in terms of, boundaries. And if someone was in my clinic, chances are we would kind of like delve into that, the history of, what happened with that.
So if we're going to start building vulnerability into our relationships, where do we start?
Yeah. Okay. So that vulnerability is a good idea, sharing that. And then so I would say the next thing we got to do is start to become aware of our feelings. And going back to, and if you can practice, and this is a really tough practice because our draw to experience anger is so strong. And so it's going to take some practice to, when we notice we're angry, to pause and try to reflect on what's underneath it. So I would say maybe not start when you're angry, but then to day, and I have a kind of a feelings log we can call it vulnerability log, which I give to, unfortunately, more of the time male clients is what it is. And, even, twice a day, check in with what are you feeling? And it doesn't have to be huge, kind of what you were saying, Nathan, it could be parts of it. Part of me is feeling blank, part of me is feeling blank. So to first start to become aware and turn into it. And then I recommend share highlights of your feelings log, your vulnerability log with your partner, ideally at your weekend check-in, right? But that's kind of like first starting to become aware of it, and then also understand the benefits of sharing it. Also, if you want to be vulnerable or learn vulnerability, I think it's, I'm a therapist, right? So I push therapy, but even sharing what's really real with you with maybe try with a therapist first, and then maybe get more comfortable doing it with your partner. But that experience, learning, kind of going back to what I'm sharing, which is, oh my God, I share what's up with me, and this person feels more connected to me, right? It's just one of those really cool things.
I think that's why like the bathrooms in clubs are like such, a hive activities of like vulnerable conversations. Like, I don't know what's going on in the guys' toilets, but in the girls' toilets, there is vulnerable conversations happening in there with strangers. Like after a few drinks, talking to a stranger about relationship with anyone, what's going on at work, in their romantic relationship, with their family, with their siblings, with their friends, whatever. I think there's like, it's a container of like, I'm never going to see this person again. And if they do or I do, we're probably not going to remember the clarity of this conversation. But I think it almost creates like this container of safety to like say what I really think or feel what I'm really feeling, and then put a label to it and say the thing, which is so interesting, right? That it's easy to say some of the deepest, darkest, most precious thoughts to a stranger, like a therapist.
Yeah, great point. I agree.
Yeah. But Jason, I really like that point that you were talking about before about your feelings log or that type of thing. Because I know that one of the things that has been really valuable to Sammy and myself is actually just pulling up a feelings wheel, because quite often you might have that feeling of anger. Like, let's use that as an example, that you've got this feeling of anger, but really the anger is the real top level kind of emotion. And there's actually something that's going to be underlying that's causing you to feel that anger. And so this feelings wheel or this emotions wheel has been like really valuable to us in actually trying to dig down into what is it that I'm actually feeling, and what is the underlying emotion, and then you can start seeing some of the commonalities that are coming up as well. Like, every time that I'm feeling angry, is it going to the same type of thing or not?
Yeah, that's great. And then, I'm a therapist, is it going to the same topic, and then being able to delve into that topic, right? To explore that. But yeah, that's really, really good stuff from my perspective.
Yeah, and it's such a basic tool. Like, if you've not ever seen one before, it's like almost like a pinwheel. There's like the center wheel, and then as it gets further out, the segments get smaller and more specific. And Nath probably has observed me do this plenty of times, where I've got off of a phone call or a meeting, and I'm like, I don't know what just happened. I don't know what I'm feeling. And then I'll pull out my little feelings wheel. But now I have an app, and be like, okay, let me just examine, like, what is it? Was it this? Was it this? Was it this? And I feel like even just building my own literacy of emotions and identifying what do they truly feel like in my body. Where do I feel anger? Where do I feel surprise? Where do I feel happiness, sadness, cheekiness, joyfulness, curiosity? Like, what happens in my body when I feel those things? And even just becoming more aware of those has helped me identify emotions and sometimes move through them faster than I might have otherwise got stuck in feeling sad or angry or grief or feeling like failure or any of those kind of, it's not like positive and negative, but like the darker kind of emotions. So I think that's that's been incredibly helpful for us. And even just using that language of feelings allows for way more vulnerability than the top level of like, I'm angry. It's like, okay, well, dig a bit more. What's underneath that?
Yeah, I love it.
So, Jason, we've been unpacking, I guess, about your early marriage and some of the things that were, I guess, challenging in that relationship. But what I'd love to do is kind of flip it to your now current marriage and just learn a little bit about some of the things that you're doing within your current relationship and your current marriage to keep it fueled up.
Yeah. Well, my wife and I, we try to do, I'm adding myself, weekend or weekly check-ins. I think that's really important. And also we have two little kids. So we really need to kind of get on the same page in terms of parenting, schedule, also finances. But, my wife and I, our flavor of this connection is we tend to be more avoidant ish. Like I'm sort of diverting here. But, after my divorce, I said, okay, well, I don't want to do that again. So I picked someone, which was kind of the opposite, which tends to someone who was tend to be more avoidant,
Oh
like
no,
me.
two avoidance
Yeah, I know.
in one relationship.
I know. So
Do you holiday separately? I bet you do.
yeah, we definitely like our free time, right?
Yeah.
We're like hermits, right? 100%. You got it. And Sam, I don't know, like relationship counselor, coach. I'm just saying for a side gig for you. But yeah, and so our flavor of this connection can tend to be more disconnection, more roommates, right? More co-parents. And so we really have to work at it. It's not like my ex where we are like arguing all the time, right? We don't really do that. And you mentioned this earlier, our flavor would tend to be sweep things under the rug. Everything's cool.
Yeah. So it's the opposite, right? In your first marriage about like, oh, we need to be careful when the fireworks are going off. And then with your marriage now, the danger zone is when there's no fireworks, nothing's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting. I think that's so worthwhile for couples to get to know, like, what's like the healthy climate of our relationship versus like what are some of the indicators that things are not going so well, or what are some indicators that things are going really well. And if we don't know what that looks like, let's imagine what that could look like. Well, how often are we connecting during the day? How often are we having sex? How often are we having like truly deep, meaningful conversations? How often are we doing something that we've never done before? How often are we connecting outside of the home? How often are we talking about work and finances and all of those things? Like, if your relationship was like the best it could ever be, or that you could ever imagine, what would it look like? What would it sound like? What would it feel like? I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And like just getting that open, and talking about it, essentially as a couples therapist, I'm pushing couples to be collaborative. And then even in terms of, whatever it is, if you want more emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, but especially after our second kid, our sex life plummeted, which is kind of a common thing. And instead of in the past, I'm avoidant, not talk about it. Maybe I'll kind of like pout, and then maybe she'll ask and I'll be like, oh yeah, we're not having enough sex. Right. That would be kind of like the old Jason. But
the
old
new Jason does not sound very sexy. That does not sound like a way to get your woman in bed.
No. Yeah. Like passive aggressive withdrawal, pouting. Right.
Yeah.
For some reason doesn't work very well.
That's not a mood setter.
100%. And so don't do that. And so the new Jason is like, hey, I've noticed we've not been having sex, and then kind of like not blaming. I'm staying on my side. I may have even request, hey, I would like to have more sex, or at the very least talk about it, and then from there, I remember a conversation. We were actually on vacation and my wife was really, really vulnerable. And she shared some of her issues or the relationship that she's currently having with her body after the birth of our second child. And it's like, oh my God, it was so good to hear that. And some of the things I didn't know she was struggling with. And that vulnerability, it created that emotional connection, right? Which is not about me, right? It's not that I'm not sexy. I'm not doing my old pouting, right? It's not that she doesn't desire me. But that was really, really important. And it made me have empathy. Okay, right now is a season where we're not going to have wild, passionate sex every night, right? So to kind of like put that in perspective. And so that was really important. So that kind of going back, answer your question, if you're getting something or you have a need or want that's not being met, the first thing to do is talk about it, but sharing on your side.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your first marriage, your journey to becoming a couples therapist, your current marriage. What I'm really curious about is like to round this kind of conversation out is one of the things that we say a lot is that your relationship with yourself sets the tone for every other relationship that you have. So I'm curious, what are some of the things that you're doing in your own life to cultivate a really strong relationship with yourself to keep it fueled up?
Yeah, I love this topic, and I think about this a lot. Well, first is to I try to meditate every day. I kind of every other day, but I hope to get back to every day. Also, it is exercise. It's really important. And another thing is I have a practice, and this is a self-esteem practice. There's different. We can be in toxic shame, which is kind of like, we call it one down, which is the contempt. It's on us. So for example, I'm no good. I'm an idiot. I'm a piece of crap. Mm-hmm. The other end of the spectrum, and this is from PMLD, we can be one up or in grandiosity, which is you're an idiot. You're no good. The middle where we want to be is same as. I'm not better. I'm not less than. And so in my relationship with myself, I have a tendency, and this was modeled, I think where it comes from, modeled growing up. I have a tendency to be one up and sort of have contempt for other people, especially when I'm tired. I can come home and I can be in that one up and I'm like, oh my God, my wife, she is such a slob. She doesn't do dishes, blank, 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 blank. But to be aware of that. And what I do is I try to take a deep breath to bring myself down the same as, right? I try to remember all the good things she does do. Or another thing I do is I try to be accountable. What's my part in this? Right? I want to come down. Another thing I'll do is if those don't work, I will tell myself, Jason, shut up. Don't share your grandiosity, your sort of self-righteousness if you're tired, right? Or don't even share that in that sort of state of mind. What I'll do is I'll sleep on it. And if it's important, then I'll bring it up the next day, right? So that's kind of like to be aware if I'm in one up or one down. And if I'm in one down, it's good to talk about it, right? If I'm feeling a lot of shame. Another thing, I'll take a deep breath and try to exercise. So I know that was a lot.
No, I think that was a really valuable share. Thank you. Did you say, I think I didn't quite catch it. Whose framework was that? Where did you learn
it? It was
that?
PMLD.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. I found her by way of Terry Real. He's been my mentor in terms of, he teaches a lot of couples therapists in the States.
Awesome. Jason, thank you so much for spending some time with us, sharing a little bit about your story and your relationship with yourself, and a couple of those tools like vulnerability and the story I'm telling myself is, and coming at it from a place of assuming positive intent and having those emotional snippet shares. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. To say thank you, we've provided 100 days of clean water to some students in Zambia. Clean water is just so important. So thank you so much for making that possible.
Awesome. So cool. Well, thank you.
No worries. So Jason, if people want to connect with you or learn a little bit more about what you do, how can they do that?
Yeah, well, I do have a podcast. So you have listeners who are parents. The podcast is Healthy Relationship Secrets for Parents. And the idea is, how can we have a great relationship and be great parents at the same time? And also my website for my therapy practice. So, hey, maybe someone in Australia wants to fly to Denver, Colorado.
I think there's that magic
for
Zoom.
Yeah, for holiday, and then just throw in a little bit of couples therapy right there. Yeah, the website is coloradorelationshiprecovery.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks heaps for joining us. If you love what we're doing here and want more, subscribe to the Date Forever podcast to make sure you never miss an ep. Come and hang out with us and other awesome couples who are fueling up their relationships in the Thriving Couples Collective Facebook group, or check us out at fuelcollective.com.au. Until next time, keep on dating, because better relationships equal a better world.